the Georgia Bulldogs, they take down the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets in probably what I think is the greatest college football game that I have ever seen in person. It was nuts. 8 overtimes, Abe Gordon. I know we talked about this a little bit on Saturday, but this is a game that Georgia Tech absolutely had in the bag. Georgia Tech was the better football team for pretty much the entire game up until the last 5 minutes of the fourth quarter where Georgia just pulled a rabbit out of a hat. And they did everything they needed to do. You're down 2 touchdowns late, and you get the benefit of a fumble from Haynes King in the fourth quarter. Doesn't get you a short field to go tie the game, and then it's overtime. And people can talk about the decision that Brent Key made to not go for 2 at the end of the first quarter, at the first overtime. You can question play calls of what teams were doing and what the two teams were doing when they were trying to go to the alternating 2-point conversions, which admittedly I've said this on Twitter as well. It's the dumbest way to decide a football game. I think it's it's an unmitigated disaster. That's not the way football's played. But here we are. Look, there are a lot of thoughts that I have from this game, but Georgia Tech losing it, it's not the fact that Georgia came out and won this football game. It's that Georgia Tech kind of choked it away. And it's very disappointing. I know it's very disappointing for Brent Key, very disappointing for Haynes King, who was clearly, in my opinion, the best player on that football field. He looked healthy for the first time in the last 5 weeks or so. And it unlocks that level of potential of what the Georgia Tech offense and that Georgia Tech team can be if he is healthy and playing at full strength, which he's not at full strength, but they will be when he gets to the bowl game coming up in December or January, wherever they end up playing. But the Dawgs, they effectively clinch a playoff berth. I know people were clamoring about the broadcast. I couldn't hear the broadcast. I was at the game. I was down on the sideline for this game, and I'm glad I was. But I do think that Georgia's effectively locked up a playoff berth with this win, but they may even get a bye because now they get to go play in the SEC championship game. But this was a wild, wild football game.
Well, there's 2 main storylines here for me. There's the game itself, and then there's what's going on with Georgia, and I'll get to that in a moment. Outstanding fight put up by Georgia Tech. They gave everything they had and more. I do think they should have gone for 2 and either win it or lose it right there. Just dial up whatever you think is your best play. Now, on the flip side, we saw a bunch of 2-point conversions. None of them were good plays, so that's its own decision. But outstanding fight by Georgia Tech. They got yes, you have to lose the game, but nothing to be hanging your heads about. Very impressive showing for them. The question for Georgia, and we could tell pretty early, or at least I could, they got to find a way to bring it every game, and they just aren't. I talked about it leading into this game. If Georgia has their A game, it's not going to be that competitive. If they don't, there's no reason Tech can't win it. And that's kind of what we saw. They did not have their A game. They eventually found it, certainly on offense in the second half. But I don't know if you're going to beat Texas next week without playing and looking the way you did the first time against them. Because if you show up and play the way you did against Georgia Tech, it's not there. Certainly wasn't defensively. And so that's the question for Ohio State. I think it's also the question for Georgia. I think they are talented enough to win a national championship. Can they bring it multiple games in a row? That is the big question. You look at their schedule, there's not a single 3-game stretch that I would say they brought it all 3 games. They're going to have to find a way to do that in the college football playoff to survive and advance against better opponents than they have had on a given week necessarily. So I think they can still win a national championship, but they have to be able to bring their A game, and they did not do it on Friday night. It almost cost them this game. It potentially almost cost them an opportunity to stay alive for the college football playoff. But I think win or lose the SEC title game, they are in.
Yeah, I think ultimately that's just where they are. They have a pretty large benefit of the doubt, So they were probably that team entering this season when we talked about it. They're probably the squad that had the most room for error. This was the room for error game, and it looked like it showed. But Georgia Tech was a more physical team. They won. They whipped their ass. It's just. I will say this about Georgia Tech too. There aren't a lot of teams that are more physical than Georgia Tech on any given week. That's something that they've been really effective at building there on the flats and in that program. And I commend Brent Key and that program for what they've been able to do. But The big highlight here for me, though, is the fact that Carson Beck has figured it out. I think Carson Beck is the guy that Georgia needed him to be throughout the course of this season. The problem is you still have some glaring holes on that wide receiver core. There were some abysmal drops. There were some plays and moments in that game where the whole thing could have been flipped on its head. The whole damn thing. Arian Smith had I think he was responsible for 2 or 3 or 4 of those drops that they had in this game. And God, it was one of them I have. It's a video on my phone of him catching. The ball was just delivered to him perfectly. Hits him on the hands in front of his face mask, just right here in front of his face. And the ball just clanks off of his hands. And I'm sorry. If you want to go win a national championship, you got to make plays like that. You just have to make plays. And right now, I don't know if these Georgia wide receivers are making enough plays to get it done. I think Carson Beck is. And I think the health of Etienne is going to be extremely important as they move into the SEC championship next week and into the playoff after that. But